Everywhere I go, I carry this tiny little rock and keep it in my pocket. And today, I want to tell you a little bit about why I do that. I was really fortunate to grow up on the farm with my dad and my two older evil brothers. One of the jobs that the evil brothers always saddled me with was picking stones. Every spring, when the snow would melt, a new crop of stones would magically appear. Now, if you're a farmer, you know that they never magically disappear. And so the tedious job that I had really only had one rule, and that was pick the big stones first. And of course, the reason is obvious if you're a farmer. If you ever get a stone that goes into the combine, if it's a little stone, it's going to make a racket. If it's a big stone, it's a big problem. So often as I'm picking stones, I would just carry them in my hands. Sometimes we had a bucket, but sometimes I'm just carrying them in my arms. And you got your arms full of stones, and as you're walking along, you come across inevitably a big stone. And no matter how hard you try to, move the rocks from one side to the other and lean down with you and pick up a big stone, you can't pick up a big stone when your arms are full of little stones. And so that tedious job taught me two really important lessons that only those with dirt under their fingernails will really understand. The first is always handle big stones first. Do first things first. Remember this, what you focus on grows. I say that again, what you focus on grows. And what you focus on first each day in your business determines what's going to grow, determines the direction of the day. Some days I do second things first. Some days I'll wake up and I'll check emails and I'll check texts and phone messages and so on. And when I do second things first, it means I give away my most important asset, my focus. Think about it. 90% of those text messages and such are about someone else's agenda. It's about someone else's priorities. So the second important lesson from this tedious job is you can't pick up big stones when your arms are filled with little stones. The leadership translation here, when we're occupied with 100 tasks on a growing to-do list, many of these things are little stones that literally take our focus in 100 different directions. And in the end of the day, we really have no focus. And as a result, nothing grows except the to-do list, really. We miss opportunity, right? We can't pick up big opportunities, big stones, when our hands are full of little stones. And so these big stones principles are the first key step in achieving what I call really the only truly sustainable competitive advantage in business. And that is the ability to learn, to unlearn, and to relearn. I'll say that again. It's the only truly sustainable competitive advantage in business now, to learn, unlearn, and relearn. So figuring out what your big stones are is what it means to learn. Big stones represent your why, your mission, right? The epicenter of you and your business. It represents what under no circumstances can change. So let me give you an example. Maybe your big stones is to be customer first focused instead of competitor first focused. Or maybe one of your big stones is your legacy, the story you're trying to tell, either your children or your customers. Some farmers, their big stones is family, their health, personal health, profitability is a big stone. No matter what your big stones are, and you have to figure those out, here's the takeaway. We must know our big stones first, because you can't begin to embrace change until you know what can't change. So once you know your big stones, you've got this really cool new decision-making tool. It creates all kinds of clarity. You simply run your situation through the big stones framework. So for example, someone asks of you about a new business idea. Someone wants you to sit on a board of directors or to volunteer at something. Whatever it is, you run it through your big stones framework. How does this idea impact my focus first on my customers? How does it impact our profitability, my family, my legacy, and so on? And so this is one of the key ways to create clarity in the midst of uncertainty, which is what's happening these days, because you know the difference between your mission, your big stones, the things that cannot change, and your methods, the little stones, the things that change all the time. So next we're going to look here at unlearn. This is a really cool one. And why would we need to unlearn? So we have experienced all kinds of rapid change and disruption, especially in recent years from technology. That acceleration has been mind-blowing in some ways. About the time of the First World War, knowledge was doubling about every 100 years. A couple of years ago, IBM projected that by the early 2020s, about now, that knowledge will be doubling in some sectors every 12 hours. Think of what that does to your knowledge and your assumptions. Mark Twain said that it ain't what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you do know that just ain't so. And so we live in this era now where what we know or what we think we know has the shortest shelf life in history. And this is why unlearn is so incredibly important. And then COVID hits. Suddenly the future is arriving faster than we ever imagined. Changes we thought would happen over time happen overnight. Vulnerabilities in our infrastructure are exposed immediately. Issues you thought that the next generation will have to deal with are suddenly on your plate. Our assumptions, our knowledge, where and how we work, how we purchase, all of it forever altered almost instantly. So let's just breathe a little bit and gain a little perspective. A fellow I've always really respected, his name was Peter Drucker, business management guru, and this is what he said. The greatest danger in these times of turbulence is not the turbulence, but is to act with yesterday's logic. With yesterday's logic, the answers are pretty much always logical, pretty much. But we're in an era now where that isn't always the truth anymore. So to unlearn, right, to unlearn yesterday's logic, it really helps to embrace the nature of contradiction. It's a key leadership strategy to really embrace the nature of paradox, because unless we do, we really will find it hard to understand innovation. Uber is a paradox, right? You can't be the largest taxi company in the world and own no taxis. It just doesn't make sense. So as soon as we start to embrace paradox, like this paradox right here, that unlearn is a key component of learning. And that's because it is only through discarding old assumptions that we avoid acting with yesterday's logic. I often call this real world thinking. Have you ever done this? You hear a crazy idea and you say to yourself, oh, that's a nice idea. But in the real world, that would never work. The problem now when we're judging new and even maybe crazy sounding ideas with real world criticism is that we can only compare to what we know, the past, yesterday's logic. Henry Ford once famously said that if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. When all we've ever done is ride a horse, real world criticism, right? Yesterday's logic says that a steel machine with wheels, well, that'll never work. Real world criticism is dangerous because it is yesterday's logic. And it's all we know, but it's the reason we often miss new innovation. So unlearn is key. It's also a bit tricky because you see, our problem is that we don't know the answers to new questions. But a bigger problem is that we can't actually question the old answers. Jim Collins, back about 2009, he wrote this book called How the Mighty Fall. And he said this: what brings companies down is a reluctance to question the answers. So for us to question the answers, we need to develop this disruptive mindset that goes with unlearning. And this is how we effectively unlearn. So I'll give you a quick, funny example. My father-in-law, man, he was a straight shooter. He was a farmer. He was literal. He was logical. And so this one day I showed up with this 2-seater red sports car. And I could tell immediately from his reaction, he was not terribly impressed because this is not a very logical automobile. And, you know, he was right. And so he comes up to me somewhat tongue-in-cheek and says, so, how do you like the little red sports car? And I somewhat tongue-in-cheek said back to him, well, it's not too bad. Doesn't have reverse, but other than that, it's a nice car. And he looked at me and he said, why would a person buy a car without reverse? See, a disruptive mindset is really important because when we disrupt the norm, the status quo, this actually signals the brain to learn. And researchers at Yale have proven this, that when we repeat the same patterns, the same thoughts, literally the comfort zone, that's what we call it, it is a shut-off switch for the brain. Think about it. When you're in the comfort zone, when you're just doing your thing, when you're just repeating what's been done, what happens? In reality, nothing. Nothing grows, nothing changes, nothing improves. But when you add disruption, when you break a status quo pattern of thinking, this signals the brain to kickstart learning. And this is why a disruptive mindset is a valuable asset in learn, unlearn, and relearn. George Bernard Shaw said that all progress depends on the unreasonable mind, a disruptive mindset, right? This challenges the answers and switches the brain on. And this is how we unlearn, by being unreasonable with the answers. And this leads to our final step here, and that is to relearn. And to do this, it requires asking disruptive questions. So let me give you one here, just real quick. Is it possible that the last person to ever own a driver's license is now alive? Think about that. Is it possible that the last person to ever need a driver's license is alive right now? So, in other words, by about 2036, no one's going to need a driver's license because vehicles will all be autonomous. So when you ask a disruptive question like that, it does a number of things. First, it questions convention, raises the eyebrows going, really? Because yesterday's logic to most of us says, wow, things are really changing fast, but they don't change that fast. Really. The phone was invented about 1878. Took 75 years for the telephone to reach 100 million users. That's like a person's lifetime. The cell phone reached 100 million users in 16 years. The internet did it in 7 years. And you remember that Pokemon, that augmented reality game? It reached 100 million users in 14 days. Relearn is about asking disruptive questions that raise the eyebrows and force us to look at our situation through new eyes. We have to consider what seems improbable now in our decision making because, if you've likely noticed, improbable has become fairly routine lately. A disruptive mindset that asks disruptive questions is how we relearn. So let me leave you with just a list of disruptive questions that create clarity. Now, these are 5 of the many disruptive questions that we address in the Forward Factor keynotes. 2 in particular. One's called the X Factor and the other's called the Deciding Factor. But I will give you 5 right now that entrepreneurs around the world use and help to make better decisions. The first one is this. It's like in COVID. Normally we would ask the question, man, what a mess. How do we fix this? But the disruptive question is, what a mess. What does this make possible that wasn't possible before? Number 2, when we're in a tough situation like we're in these days, often we ask, what do we do? What do I do? But the disruptive question is, and the better question is, what would my replacement do? Number 3, it's logical to look at a new situation. We got to make a change. And so we say, what is the cost? But the disruptive question is, what is the cost if we do nothing? Number 4, and this one's really relevant and a challenge, and we can't deal with it in a short time, but are we still focused on being an analog first organization in what is now clearly a digital first world? And the last one, are we focused? Are we focused on anything? And more importantly, are we focused on making excuses or making progress, because you can't make both. When you commit to learn, unlearn, and relearn, you will master the only truly sustainable competitive advantage. If you will learn, unlearn, and relearn, I guarantee you're going to start eating like a pig and you're going to poop like a pigeon. You will consume new ideas and innovation like a pig, and just like a pigeon, you're going to be dropping fertile ideas everywhere you go. And that is why I carry this tiny little rock. It reminds me that I must know my big stones first. We can't embrace change until we know for sure what cannot change. Then we're free to learn, unlearn, and relearn. It is one of the X factors that creates clarity in the midst of uncertainty, and I guarantee it'll make you a great decision maker.